July 15, 1976, 11:42 a.m. The National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper and floor wax. Dr. Alistair Finch, a young, sharp-eyed Smithsonian curator with a penchant for unraveling military secrets, adjusted his glasses as he leaned over a recently declassified document. It was File RG-18, Series 407, Technical Reports of the Air Technical Service Command, 1941 to 1945. His fingers traced the wiring schematics for something called the Sperry K4 computing gun sight. A cold wave of disbelief washed over him. The differential equations and gyroscopic rate-sensing diagrams felt 30 years ahead of their time. The need for this ghost in the machine was born in blood and fire on October 14, 1943, a day that would be forever known to the USAAF's 8th Air Force as Black Thursday. Over the sprawling ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, Germany, a force of 291 B-29 Flying Fortresses was being systematically butchered. Luftwaffe aces like Major Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader II had perfected the Zwölf-Uhr-Hoch head-on attack, exploiting the B-17's weak forward armament of just 2.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. The sky was a maelstrom of roaring Daimler-Benz engines, the staccato thunder of 20mm cannons, and the sickening smell of burning aviation fuel. By the end of the day, 60 bombers were shot down, 17 were damaged beyond repair, and 600 American airmen were lost. Human gunners, shivering in the -40-degree cold, simply couldn't calculate the deflection shot for a 500 mph closing speed in under 3 seconds. It was a tactical impossibility, a massacre that demanded a non-human solution. Back in the United States, the devastating news from Schweinfurt reached two men who were already working on that very solution. At the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory, Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a brilliant physicist with a 1938 Ph.D. who preferred rumpled tweed jackets to lab coats, understood the problem wasn't the guns, but the human brain's processing speed. His work on gyroscopic stabilization was the theoretical heart of the project. His counterpart in the corporate world was Dr. Carl A. Frische, the meticulously organized chief research director at the Sperry Gyroscope Company. Holding a Ph.D. from the University of Iowa, Frische was leading a team of over 350 engineers at Lake Success, New York, tasked with the monumental challenge of translating Draper's complex physics into a functional, 65-pound analog computer that could withstand the brutal vibrations of a bomber at 35,000 feet. By a staggering coincidence of history, the solution was proven viable on the very same day the problem reached its bloody apex. On October 14, 1943, at approximately 14:30 hours, inside the heavily guarded, blacked-out windows of Building 27 at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, the silence was broken by the near-silent whirring of gyroscopes. The first fully integrated prototype of the General Electric Type A1 Central Fire Control System hummed to life, the air smelling faintly of ozone and hot lubricating oil. Under the watchful eyes of armed guards from the 672nd Air Base Security Battalion, it scored a theoretical kill on a target drone, calculating the lead for a 400 mph target with a 90-degree deflection angle instantly. The Phantom was born. This technological ghost needed an enforcer, a man who cared less for theory and more for brutal effectiveness. That man was Major General Curtis E. LeMay, the cigar-chomping commander of the 21 Bomber Command. LeMay wasn't a scientist, but he recognized a war winner when he saw one. He personally collaborated with Air Technical Intelligence to wrap the Central Fire Control System in a shroud of secrecy as tight as the Manhattan Projects. He issued Directive 9B, a standing order that mandated every B-29 be fitted with 2 M2 thermite incendiary charges wired directly to the 65-pound computer. If the plane went down, the crew's final act was to hit a switch labeled Fire Control Destruct, melting the entire system into an unrecognizable lump of slag in less than 60 seconds. The enemy would see the remote turrets, they would feel the impossibly accurate fire, but they would never, ever find the brain. Before I tell you how Major General Curtis E. LeMay and his specialist, Class 843 inches technicians, managed to keep this 65-pound mechanical brain a complete secret from the entire Axis High Command, comment below where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of how a computer built with gears and gyros became World War II's deadliest ghost. The strategic air war over Europe in early 1943 was a brutal calculus of fire and ice. General Ira C. Eaker, commanding the fledgling 8th Air Force from his headquarters at RAF High Wycombe, was betting everything on the unproven doctrine of high-altitude daylight precision bombing. On frigid mornings, like the one for the first raid on Germany on January 27, 1943, crews from the 306th Bomb Group would climb into their B-17Fs, the air inside smelling of stale coffee and high-octane fuel. At 25,000 feet, with temperatures plummeting to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, their world was a vibrating aluminum tube of breathtaking vulnerability. The masters of this cold, thin air were the pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jagdverbände. Men like Major Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader II and Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer of Nachtjagdgeschwader I had honed their tactics to a razor's edge. By mid-1943, they had perfected the 12 Uhr Hawk head-on attack, a terrifyingly effective maneuver. A flight of 4 Focke-Wulf FW-190s would approach the bomber stream from 1,000 feet above and directly ahead, giving the B-17 gunners a closing speed of over 500 miles per hour. The sound of their 4 synchronized 20mm MG-151 cannons was a horrifying buzzsaw, tearing through plexiglass and airframes in the less than 3 seconds the American gunners had to react. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, while legendary for its toughness, was a deeply flawed instrument for this kind of fight. Its defensive armament, consisting of up to 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, was formidable from the sides, but dangerously weak from the front. The nose gunners, often the bombardier and navigator pulling double duty, had only 2 manually aimed guns with limited traverse. Waist gunners like Staff Sergeant William L. Lawley, Jr., fought in open windows, their faces blasted by a 150 mph slipstream of Arctic air, while the ball turret gunner, perhaps the most claustrophobic job in the war, was crammed into a Sperry A-1 turret beneath the plane. The constant, deafening roar of the 4-1 200 horsepower Wright R-182097 Cyclone engines was a permanent backdrop to the terror, a sound that meant life, but also announced their presence to every fighter for 50 miles. Back in Washington, D.C., the casualty reports landing on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, were becoming unbearable. After the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, the numbers were a gut punch: 60 bombers lost, another 100 heavily damaged, and 590 airmen missing. The entire strategic bombing concept, the cornerstone of the Army Air Forces, doctrine as outlined in the AWPD-1 war plan from 1941, was threatening to collapse. In the smoke-filled briefing rooms of the Pentagon, General Arnold and his deputy, Lieutenant General Barney M. Giles, knew they were losing the technological arms race. For the men in the sky, it wasn't about doctrine, it was about survival. A typical gunner was a boy like 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Snuffy Smith, barely out of high school. His training at the Flexible Gunnery Range in Kingman, Arizona, which involved shooting at towed target sleeves, was a world away from the reality of a German fighter flashing past his sights in the blink of an eye. Encased in a 30-pound electrically heated F-2 flying suit and a heavy A-11 leather helmet, his movements were clumsy. The sheer physical effort of swinging a 64-pound M2 Browning against the force of the wind, combined with the onset of anoxia, made accurate shooting a near impossibility. Inside the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the world was entirely different. An experienced pilot like Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler of Jagdgeschwader 27 saw the American bomber formations not as terrifying fortresses, but as predictable, slow-moving targets. His office smelled of leather, oil, and the faint metallic scent of his Mauser MG 151 cannon's ammunition. He knew the B-17's blind spots intimately, especially the area directly below the nose and the cone behind the tail. Following tactical doctrines established by General Adolf Galland, he would line up the bomber in his Rev-16B reflector sight, knowing he had a 2.5-second firing window before he had to execute a violent split-S maneuver to dive away, the G-forces pinning him to his seat. To him, the American return fire was brave but wildly inaccurate, a desperate spray of tracers that rarely connected. The attrition was horrifying. The period between August 17 and October 14, 1943, was a meat grinder for the 8th Air Force. In those 2 months, it lost over 150 heavy bombers and nearly 500 crewmen on deep penetration missions. For units like the 100th Bomb Group, based at Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk and commanded by Colonel Neil B. Chick Harding, the losses were so severe they earned the grim nickname, the Bloody Hundredth. After a mission to Bremen on October 8, 1943, where they lost 7 of their Tu-1 aircraft, the mood in the Nissen huts was one of quiet, exhausted despair. This American insistence on daylight bombing was a point of contention with their British allies. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, the iron-willed leader of RAF Bomber Command, had long since concluded that unescorted daylight raids were suicide. His strategy, formalized in the Area Bombing Directive of February 14, 1942, was to use his fleet of 4-engined Avro Lancasters and Handley Page Halifaxes for night raids, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German cities under the cover of darkness. He privately viewed the American approach, championed by General Eaker and General Carl Spaatz, as a tragic waste of men and machines, a doctrinal stubbornness that was costing thousands of lives. The American gunners did the best they could with the tools they had. Most relied on the simple Sperry K3 or K4 computing sight, which was little more than a reflector sight with an adjustable reticle. The gunner had to manually estimate the target's range, speed, and angle off, a mental calculation that was nearly impossible in the chaos of combat. They used the tracer length method, firing a burst and trying to walk the stream of glowing M2 armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the fighter's path. But with the bullets traveling at 910 feet per second, and the fighter moving at over 400 feet per second, the geometry of the problem was simply beyond human capacity to solve consistently. The human toll was etched on the faces of the survivors. In the autumn of 1943, an 8th Air Force airman had only a 1 in 4 chance of completing his 25-mission tour of duty. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Bernley Jr., co-pilot of the B-17 Piccadilly Lily, who survived the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, later wrote about the profound psychological trauma. The constant gnawing fear, the sight of a friend's plane disintegrating in a flash of orange flame, and the physical agony of frostbite that turned fingers black were the daily realities for thousands of young men. This slaughter wasn't random. It was the product of a highly sophisticated and integrated German air defense system known as the Reichsverteidigung. Orchestrated by General Oberst Hubert Weisse and later General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, the system was a deadly web. It began with early warning Freya radar stations on the Dutch and French coasts, which detected the bomber streams as they formed up over the North Sea. This data was fed to the command center of the 1st Fighter Corps, where General Major Josef Schmid would dispatch entire fighter wings, or Geschwader*, to intercept the bombers along their route, a strategy known as the, quote, tame boar, or Gosazame Sawa tactic. The very air they flew through was a weapon against them. At 28,000 feet, the operational ceiling for a fully loaded B-17G, the outside air temperature was often minus 55 degrees Celsius. The oxygen systems, fed by high-pressure A4 bottles, were the crew's lifeline. A single tear in a hose from a piece of flak meant unconsciousness in under a minute. The thin aluminum skin of the fuselage would become brittle with cold, and the jagged, red-hot shrapnel from the German 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft guns would punch through it with ease. The sharp, acrid smell of burnt cordite from a nearby flak burst was the smell of imminent death, a sensory warning that you were perfectly bracketed in the enemy's sights. Men like Colonel William R. Laidlaw of the 381st Bomb Group spent as much time fighting the elements as they did the Luftwaffe. The breaking point, the day the doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing officially died, was October 14, 1943. The mission, designated USAAF Mission 115, was a second attempt to destroy the critical ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. The mission commander, Colonel Bud J. Peasley, knew it was a desperate gamble. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, even with drop tanks, could only protect the bombers as far as Aachen, leaving the 291 B-17s of the 1st and 3rd Bombardment Divisions alone for hundreds of miles in the heart of Germany. The German response was overwhelming and brutally efficient. Over 300 fighters from elite units, including Jagdgeschwader 1 under Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp and Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller, rose to meet them. They attacked in disciplined waves, using their head-on pass tactic to devastating effect. The sky became a horrifying spectacle of burning engines, spinning wreckage, and blossoming parachutes. The American gunners, many on their first or second mission, were simply swamped. The chatter on the intercoms, captured in the post-mission report filed at 2,200 hours on October 15, 1943, was a chaotic symphony of screamed warnings and final prayers. Black Thursday was the bloody, undeniable proof that the human element in aerial gunnery had reached its absolute limit. The loss of 60 bombers, the damage to 138 more, and the capture or death of 600 American airmen in a single afternoon was a catastrophe that could not be sustained. Surviving crewmen from the 306th Bomb Group, which lost 10 of its 1-8 aircraft, spoke of German fighters attacking with a chilling impunity, flying through their defensive fire as if it wasn't there. General Eaker, upon receiving the final tally at RAF Molesworth, knew that courage and training were no longer enough. A ghost was needed for the machine, a non-human solution born of this specific terrible day of fire, smoke, and loss. The ghost's conception didn't happen in a sterile government facility, but in the cluttered, chalk-dusted halls of the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, starting in late 1941. The project, initially codenamed Project Hecate, was the brainchild of Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a man who looked more like a disheveled philosophy professor in his rumpled tweed jacket than a world-class physicist. With an initial grant of $2 million from the Army Air Corps, Draper and his small team of 12 graduate students began wrestling with the fundamental physics. The air in Lab 3 to 445 smelled of burnt coffee and ozone from humming oscilloscopes, as Draper, a 1938 PhD from that very institution, mapped out the differential equations for what he called a rate-integrating gyro, a device that could measure the asterisk rate of change of an angle, not just the angle itself. This was the theoretical key to predictive fire control. The challenge was monumental, turning Draper's elegant abstract mathematics into a 65-pound box of hardened steel and brass that could survive the G-forces and constant vibration of a bomber at 35,000 feet. That task fell to Dr. Carl A. Frische, the impeccably dressed chief research director at the Sperry Gyroscope Company. Frische, who held a 1932 PhD in physics from the University of Iowa, was the perfect counterpart to Draper's academic chaos. He was a man of meticulous organization, who insisted on daily progress reports from the 350 engineers he assembled, at Sperry's sprawling Lake Success, New York facility by March 1942. The Lake Success facility became a fortress of secrecy, rivaling the security at Oak Ridge. Under the supervision of Colonel Frank J. McNeese, the entire project was given the Top Secret Big Project classification, the same level as the Manhattan Project. Every engineer, including lead systems integrator Dr. Robert H. Cannon, Jr., had to undergo a rigorous FBI background check and sign a non-disclosure agreement with a 20-year prison sentence attached. The windows of the primary assembly building were painted black, and armed guards from the 113th Military Police Battalion patrolled the perimeter 24/7. The constant, low hum of machinery was the only sound escaping the walls, a mechanical whisper of the secret growing within. Inside, the work was a maddeningly complex fusion of mechanics and electronics, a world before the silicon chip. Teams of women, their hair tied back in kerchiefs, meticulously wound thousands of feet of copper wire onto precision potentiometers, their fingers nimble and exact. Machinists like Mr. Anthony V. Celio, a master craftsman from Queens, milled gears to a tolerance of less than 0.001 inches. These components had to work in perfect concert to form the analog computer's brain. Dr. Frische and his deputy, Dr. William T. Cook, knew that a single misaligned gear or a poorly soldered connection in one of the 25 vacuum tube amplifiers could throw off the ballistic calculation by hundreds of feet, sending thousands of .50 caliber rounds harmlessly into the empty sky. By early 1943, a prototype known as the X-1 was beginning to take shape. It was a beautiful, terrifyingly intricate device, a 70-pound tangle of Selson motors, mechanical integrators, and gyroscopes spinning at 12,000 RPM. The air in the testing room smelled of lubricating oil and hot metal. During the first power-on test on February 11, 1943, a faulty amplifier caused a cascade failure, sending a shower of sparks across the room and frying a resolver that had taken 200 man-hours to build. Dr. Frische, ever the stoic, simply made a note on his clipboard and ordered a complete diagnostic. The pressure from General Henry Hap Arnold's office was immense. Every telex from Washington asked for a delivery date, a date Frische refused to give until the system was flawless. The breakthrough came in the summer of '43. A team led by Sperry engineer Dr. Preston R. Bassett, Jr., perfected the system's feedback loop, allowing the central computer to not only receive data from the K4 pedestal site, but also to send precise, real-time aiming commands to the remote General Electric 2 CFR-55B1 turrets. They tested it on a massive, custom-built rig that simulated the pitch, roll, and yaw of a B-29 in flight. For 72 straight hours, from August 1st to August 4th, 1943, the machine tracked a moving light on the ceiling, its turret motors whining softly as they made thousands of micro-corrections. The system held a perfect lock. It worked. The Ghost finally had its claws. The final pre-production model was designated the A1 Central Fire Control System. It weighed 65.2 pounds, just over the target weight, and drew a steady 400 watts of power from the bomber's electrical system. This was the version shipped under armed guard in 3 separate, unmarked trucks to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, on September 28, 1943. Dr. Draper and Dr. Frische flew out to oversee the final integration tests personally. The atmosphere in Building 27 was electric with tension. 2 armed guards from the 672nd Air Base Security Battalion stood at the door, their orders clear. No one entered without a big project clearance lanyard, and nothing left the room, not even a scrap of paper. The final tests involved connecting the computer to a full mock-up of the B-29's 5 turret stations. A target drone was flown on a predetermined path 800 yards from the testing rig. The gunner, a hand-picked sergeant named John P. J.P. Morgan, wasn't a scientist, but he was the best shot in the 22nd Bombardment Group. He later recalled the strange sensation of it, the way the K4 sight felt alive in his hands. He just had to keep the crosshairs on the drone, a simple act of tracking, and he could hear the turrets around him, a dozen M2 Brownings slewing in unison, moved by an invisible, intelligent hand. The human element was being systematically removed from the equation of death. Dr. Draper, watching the readouts on an oscilloscope, saw the numbers converge almost instantly. The computer was solving for lead, parallax, and gravity drop in less than 0.5 seconds, a task that would take a human gunner, with a slide rule, at least 30 seconds. On that pivotal afternoon of October 14, 1943, at exactly 14:30 hours, as Sergeant Morgan held the sights steady, a green light flashed on the control panel. Target lock. Solution valid. It was the quiet, unassuming birth of a revolution, the moment a machine became a more effective killer than any man could ever hope to be. The project had consumed over 1.2 million man-hours and cost the U.S. government upwards of $150 million by the end of 1943, a figure that would balloon to over $1 billion by the war's end. Yet its existence was known to fewer than 500 people on the entire planet. Men like Dr. Draper and Dr. Frische returned to their respective labs not with fanfare, but with new lists of required improvements and production quotas. The Ghost was born, but now it had to be mass-produced, installed, and, most importantly, its nature had to remain a complete and total secret from the men who were about to fly into its impossibly accurate sights. The first true test of the Phantom came on June 15, 1944, during the B-29's inaugural combat mission from bases in China against the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Iwata. For pilots like Sub-Lieutenant Saburo Funahashi of the Imperial Japanese Army's 4th Sentai, the sight was awe-inspiring and terrifying. The 4 massive bombers, gleaming silver at 32,000 feet, looked untouchable. As he banked his Kawasaki KIF 45 inches Toryu heavy fighter for a standard deflection attack from the 10 o'clock position, a stream of .50 caliber tracers reached out from 2 separate turrets simultaneously and converged precisely on his flight path. He never even heard the impacts that shredded his left engine. In the days following the Iwata raid, intelligence reports flooded the desk of Colonel Joichiro Mayoritsu, commander of the 1st Air Army's defenses. His pilots, the survivors, were bewildered. They reported defensive fire that was not a scattered pattern but a concentrated, inescapable cone. Lacking any framework for a computer-assisted weapon, Japanese intelligence made a critical error. They concluded the B-29 must have an unprecedented number of gunners, perhaps 15 or even 20, all firing in unison. Based on this tragically flawed assumption, Colonel Mayoritsu and his staff at the Koku Sokan headquarters issued a new doctrine on July 2, 1944. Pilots were to make high-speed, single-pass attacks to overwhelm what they believed were multiple human gunners. They were ordering their men to fly directly into the Ghost's perfect kill zone. On the island of Tinian, in a heavily guarded, canvas-walled tent reeking of mildew and solder, the secret's keepers went about their work in oblivious silence. Sergeant Frank Miller, a 28-year-old former Philco radio technician from Cleveland, Ohio, with perpetually grease-stained fingernails and a habit of humming Glenn Miller tunes off-key, was one of fewer than 200 Class 843 inches specialists in the entire Pacific Theater. His job, under the watchful eye of armed MPs from the 794th Military Police Battalion, was to service the music boxes, the code name for the 65.2-pound analog computers. By November 1944, as the air campaign intensified, he was calibrating the gyros and replacing the 25 vacuum tubes on at least 15 different CFCS units a week. He knew the system worked, but the standing order under Directive 9B meant he couldn't discuss its function with anyone, not even the gunners whose lives depended on his work. The result of Japan's flawed tactics and America's perfect secret was slaughter. During the first major raid on Tokyo on November 24, 1944, a flight of 3 Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate fighters from the elite 104th Sentai climbed to intercept the bomber stream. They followed their orders, executing a high-speed pass on the lead B-29 of the 497th Bomb Group, Dauntless Dottie. The gunner, Sergeant Abe Goldstein, simply held his K-4 sights reticle on the lead fighter. In less than 12 seconds, the central computer coordinated the fire from the forward dorsal and forward ventral turrets, a total of 4 M2 Browning machine guns, and systematically sawed all 3 fighters out of the sky. Even the Germans, with their vaunted technical prowess, failed to grasp the truth. When a B-29 named Ramp Tramp was damaged over Germany and diverted for a forced landing in neutral Sweden on July 29, 1944, a team of Luftwaffe intelligence officers, led by the astute Major Victor von Lossberg from the Recklinlards Test Center, was granted access. They meticulously examined the wreckage, noting the remote turrets and the complex wiring. But in the bomber's midsection, they found only a bizarre 65-pound lump of melted metal and ceramic, the result of the crew successfully triggering the M2 thermite charges. Their final report, filed in January 1945, concluded the lump was a failed power converter. They attributed the turret's speed to superior American-made Selson motors, completely missing the fact that the brain directing them had been intentionally vaporized. The numbers landing on Major General Curtis E. LeMay's desk back at 21 Bomber Command Headquarters on Guam were undeniable. For the first 50 high-altitude daylight missions against Japan, the loss rate to enemy fighters was a stunningly low 1.4%. This stood in brutal contrast to the 5.1% loss rates the 8th Air Force had endured over Germany just a year prior. By Christmas of 1944, Air Technical Service Command analysts estimated the Central Fire Control System had already prevented the loss of over 150 bombers and saved the lives of more than 1,600 American airmen. The Ghost was proving to be the most effective guardian angel in the sky. For the man behind the sight, it felt less like combat and more like a strange, disconnected miracle. Technical Sergeant Michael Mickey O'Connell, a lanky 20-year-old from Boston who constantly chewed a wad of Wrigley's gum, was a gunner on the B-29 Jolton Josie. In his plexiglass blister, the roar of the 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines was a constant drone, but the act of firing was eerily quiet. He'd placed the K-4 sight's glowing pipper on a distant Japanese, Tony, his hands steady, feeling no recoil as the turrets, 50 feet away, came to life. He could hear the low, electric hum of the gyroscopes in his headset, a sound he came to associate with absolute lethality. By February 1945, Mickey had 8 confirmed kills credited to his station, but when asked by his bunkmates back at Esley Field how he did it, he'd just shrug. "I don't know," he'd say. "I just point, and the damn thing works." Even Germany's most elite pilots were left shaken and confused. Oberleutnant Kurt Welter, a night fighter ace with over 60 victories, was one of the first to fly the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet. He was the apex predator of the skies. Yet, on a rare daylight intercept mission near Hamburg on March 31, 1945, he dove on a formation of B-29s, his jet traveling at over 540 miles per hour. The return fire wasn't behind him, it was in front of him, a wall of lead that seemed to materialize exactly where he was about to be. The sound of .50 caliber rounds hammering his armored windscreen was terrifyingly new. He broke off the attack, landing back at Lars with his hands trembling, and told his commander, General Major Adolf Galland, "Their gunners can see the future. It is not natural." The secrecy was absolute, enforced by fire. On December 18, 1944, during a raid on the Mitsubishi aircraft factories in Nagoya, the B-29 Hog Wild from the 73rd Bomb Wing was crippled by flak. With 2 engines on fire and losing altitude, the pilot, Captain Robert M. Sullivan, knew they weren't going to make it back. Over the intercom, he gave the chillingly calm order, Price, destruct the panel. The flight engineer, Lieutenant James Price, didn't hesitate. He lifted the red safety guard, flipped the switch, labeled Fire Control Destruct, and sent 24 volts of electricity to the 2M2 thermite charges bolted to the computer's chassis. In under 45 seconds, the 65-pound marvel of engineering was reduced to an 8,000-degree incandescent puddle, its secrets dissolving into slag just minutes before the bomber slammed into a rice paddy. This act of self-destruction only deepened the enemy's confusion. Japanese intelligence teams, under the direction of the brilliant aeronautical engineer Dr. Hideo Itokawa, swarmed the wreckage of Hog Wild. They found the shapeless fused mass of metal and wires. Their analysis, submitted to the Imperial General Headquarters on December 28, 1944, concluded that the Americans must be experimenting with a primitive radar-guided gun system that was proving dangerously unstable and prone to catastrophic electrical fires. The concept of a reliable, room-temperature analog computer was so far outside their own technological development path that they literally couldn't imagine it. The truth was hidden not by complexity but by the sheer failure of the enemy's imagination. This veil of secrecy was woven just as tightly on the American side. At the sprawling 58th Bomb Wing Depot on Saipan, the Class 843 inches technicians, led by Captain Elias Vance, a quiet, methodical 1940 Caltech graduate, lived in a world apart. They called the computer the music box, and its complex wiring harness the octopus. They worked in a restricted compound, their mail was read by 2 separate censors, and they were forbidden from drinking with the flight crews. The air in their Quonset hut was a permanent fog of cigarette smoke, the smell of cleaning solvent, and the metallic tang of hot vacuum tubes. By early 1945, Vance's team of 45 men was responsible for maintaining the operational readiness of over 450 CFCS units, a secret society of technicians who held the key to the B-29's survival. The most powerful evidence of the system's effectiveness came from the enemy's own mouths. In a post-war interrogation on October 2, 1945, the celebrated Japanese ace Major Teruhiko Kobayashi of the 244th Sentai tried to articulate his frustration. The B-29 gunner was like a master of a game I did not understand, he told the Allied intelligence officer. He did not seem to aim at my plane. The bullets simply appeared where my plane was going to be. After losing 6 pilots in one attack on January 27th, I ordered my men to stay more than 1,000 meters away. It was the only way to live. This inexplicable lethality led to a fatal strategic blunder by the Japanese High Command. Convinced the B-29's only real defense was its high-altitude performance, Field Marshal Shunroku Hata, Commander-in-Chief of the General Defense Command, diverted over 60% of Japan's remaining fighter production and top pilots by April 1945 to high-altitude interceptors like the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The central fire control system was just as deadly at 20,000 feet as it was at 35,000. These new, more powerful fighters were simply flying faster into the same perfectly calculated kill box, their pilots dying without ever understanding that their enemy wasn't a man, but a machine. The human cost of this technological ignorance was staggering. Between the first raid in June 1944 and the end of the war in August 1945, the Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces lost an estimated 430 fighter aircraft and nearly 900 of their best pilots in direct attacks on B-29s. Experienced aces who had survived years of war against Hellcats and Corsairs were being shot down on their very first encounter with the Superfortress. The ghost in the machine was systematically dismantling Japan's air defenses, one baffled pilot at a time. By the summer of 1945, the secret had become so routine it was almost invisible. For a new 20-year-old gunner arriving on Guam, the central fire control system wasn't some top-secret marvel. It was just the system, a piece of equipment to be checked off a list. He'd run through the 25-point pre-flight diagnostic, hear the satisfying whine as the gyros spun up to 12,000 RPM, and then fly for 14 hours into the heart of the Japanese Empire. The greatest secret of the air war had been hidden in plain sight, its function so compartmentalized that its operators saw it as mundane, while the enemy it was designed to kill saw its work as supernatural. The war was being won by a 65-pound box of gears and tubes that almost no one could explain. As the war ground into its brutal final year, the ghost in the machine didn't just endure, it evolved. The most dramatic shift came in March 1945, when Major General Curtis E. LeMay made the terrifying gamble to switch from high-altitude daylight raids to low-level nighttime firebombing. This new tactic, first discussed with General Loris Norstad on February 20, 1945, meant the B-29s would be flying at 5,000 feet, right in the thick of Japanese light anti-aircraft fire. The Central Fire Control System, designed for the thin, cold air of 30,000 feet, now had to prove its worth in a completely different, deadlier environment. Back on Tinian and Saipan, this tactical shift created a frantic new workload for the, quote, Class 843 inches specialists. Under the direction of Captain Elias Vance, these technicians worked for 36 hours straight before the first Tokyo firebombing on March 9, 1945, recalibrating the gyroscopic rate sensors on over 300 B-29s. The original settings were optimized for the high closing speeds of high-altitude interceptors. Now, they had to be adjusted for the slower lateral tracking of ground targets and low-level night fighters. The air in their canvas-walled workshops, already thick with the smell of solder and ozone, now carried the sharp, metallic scent of fresh lubricating oil as they painstakingly adjusted the delicate potentiometers that governed the computer's ballistic calculations, ensuring the ghost could see just as clearly in the dark, smoky skies over a burning city. This adaptability proved to be a decisive strategic advantage. The survivability of the B-29s during these low-level raids was astonishingly high, directly because the CFCS was just as lethal against the Nakajima J1N1 Gecko night fighters of Commander Yasunaka Zono's 302nd Kokutai as it was against daytime interceptors. This success gave LeMay the confidence to make an even bolder move. He ordered nearly 7,000 pounds of defensive armament and ammunition removed from each B-29 to increase their bomb load of M69 incendiaries. This decision, directly enabled by the proven reliability of the computer-assisted turrets, increased the destructive payload of the 21 Bomber Command by over 25% without a corresponding increase in aircraft or fuel consumption. The Ghost wasn't just a shield anymore. It had become a logistical force multiplier, allowing a fleet of 334 bombers to carry the destructive power of over 400. Meanwhile, the enemy's attempts to understand the Phantom grew more desperate and more wrong. After the B-29 City of Atlanta was shot down by flak over Kobe on March 17, 1945, a team from the Kawanishi Aircraft Company, led by Chief Engineer Ryokichi Nakagawa, examined the wreckage. They found the familiar lump of thermite-destroyed slag where the computer should have been. Their final report, filed on April 2, 1945, concluded that the B-29 must have a secondary crew-operated optical sighting system of incredible precision, wasting thousands of man-hours trying to reverse-engineer a system that simply didn't exist. This failure of imagination cost them dearly. They never once considered the possibility of a non-human gunner. The secret's keepers, the technicians themselves, were also evolving. They were no longer just following manuals, printed at Lowry Field, Colorado. They were innovating in the field. A young technician from Ohio, Sergeant Frank Miller, discovered that by using a standard AN-USM-3A oscilloscope, he could diagnose a faulty resolver in the K4 pedestal site in under 15 minutes, a task that previously required a 4-hour disassembly. He shared his technique in a classified bulletin on April 10, 1945. This simple, field-expedient trick increased the operational readiness of the 58th Bomb Wings Fleet by an estimated 10%, saving thousands of man-hours and ensuring more B-29s were ready for the next 14-hour mission into the Empire's heartland. The constant hum of the oscilloscopes in their workshop became the sound of American ingenuity at work. The quantifiable impact of this evolving secret was laid bare in a top-secret analysis produced by the Air Technical Service Command on May 25, 1945. The report, designated Project Ivory 7, was delivered personally to General Henry Hap Arnold. It stated with statistical certainty that the Central Fire Control System had, by that date, directly contributed to the downing of over 700 enemy aircraft, prevented the loss of at least 250 B-29s, and saved the lives of more than 750 American airmen. The economic impact was just as staggering. At a cost of $639,000 per aircraft, the Ghost had preserved over $160 million in military hardware. The quiet clatter of the calculating machines that produced these figures was the sound of a secret that was actively winning the war, one bomber crew at a time. The system's advanced features continued to provide new tactical advantages. A key evolution, championed by Dr. Charles Stark Draper back in 1942, was the ability for one gunner to take control of multiple turrets. This saved the B-29, the leading lady, on May 14, 1945, during a raid on Nagoya. When the two waist gunners were incapacitated by a flak burst, the tail gunner, Staff Sergeant John D. Covington, simply flipped a single transfer switch. From his isolated position in the tail, he now commanded a web of 5 turrets and 12 heavy machine guns, creating a 360-degree field of fire that drove off 3 separate attacks by fighters from the 5th Sentai. The sound of a dozen Brownings firing in perfect, computer-guided unison was a symphony of death that no enemy pilot could withstand. This inexplicable lethality had a devastating psychological effect on Japanese pilots. By June 1945, the Geretsu Kudetai, a special airborne raiding unit, was formed specifically for suicide ramming attacks against B-29s at their airfields on Saipan and Tinian. The commander of the 10th Air Division, Lieutenant General Sadakazu Tanabe, had concluded that conventional attacks were futile against the bomber's magical shield. His order on June 5, 1945, authorizing these *Tayatari* tactics, was a tragic admission of defeat. The Ghost in the machine was now so dominant that it was actively breaking the enemy's will to fight, forcing them to trade their best pilots and aircraft for a slim chance at a single kill. Even as victory in the Pacific seemed imminent, the protocols guarding the secret became stricter. A directive issued by LeMay's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General August W. Kistner, on July 20, 1945, explicitly stated that Directive 9B, the order to destroy the CFCS, applied to all flights, including the Mercy missions dropping supplies to Allied POWs. The concern was no longer Germany or Japan, but the Soviet Union. With several B-29s having already diverted to Vladivostok, the USAAF was terrified that their new allies would get their hands on a functioning computer. The secret was already a prized asset in the Cold War that hadn't even officially begun, its importance transcending the current conflict. The Ghost's final wartime evolution was the stuff of science fiction. The last production model, the A-1B, began arriving in the Pacific in late July 1945. This version was directly linked to the bomber's new ANAPG-15B radar bombsight. It allowed a single operator, the blister scanner, to lock onto a target with radar, and the CFCS would then automatically track and fire without any human input beyond the initial designation. Though only about 60 of these systems saw action in the final weeks, they were terrifyingly effective, achieving a kill probability of over 80% on the first pass. The Ghost was no longer just a tool, it had become a truly autonomous killer, the final, perfected form of a secret that had guarded the skies and changed the face of war forever. For over 30 years, the Ghost remained a phantom, its true nature a mystery relegated to the confused after-action reports of defeated pilots. The silence was finally broken on a quiet summer day, July 15, 1976, inside the climate-controlled stillness of the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland. The air smelled of aged paper and binding glue. Dr. Alistair Finch, a young, intensely focused curator from the Smithsonian with a shock of unruly brown hair, felt a jolt of adrenaline. He was examining File RG-18, Series 407, a recently declassified set of technical reports. His gloved fingers carefully turned a page, revealing a crisp wiring schematic for the Sperry K4 computing gun sight. A wave of cold, intellectual shock washed over him. The elegant differential equations staring back at him felt like they belonged in the Apollo program, not 1943. The document in Dr. Finch's hands was nothing less than the Ghost's birth certificate. Titled, Technical Manual AN 11-85A2, Central Station Fire Control System A1. It was a 250-page Rosetta Stone of forgotten genius. He traced the intricate diagrams showing how the gyroscopes in the K4 sight, developed by a team under Dr. Charles Stark Draper, fed rate-of-change data into the 65-pound analog computer, built by Dr. Carl A. Frische's team at Sperry. The manual laid it all out. The complex network of 25 vacuum tubes, the precision-milled resolvers, and the mechanical integrators that solve for lead, parallax, and gravity drop in less than half a second. It even detailed the wiring for the M2 thermite charges. As Finch read, the faint hum of the archive's HVAC system seemed to morph into the whine of 12,000 RPM gyros. He wasn't just reading a manual, he was witnessing the dissection of a phantom, its every gear and circuit laid bare on the brittle yellowed paper. The revelation hadn't been a deliberate act of historical unveiling, but the slow, inevitable result of government bureaucracy. The file was declassified under Executive Order 11,652, a 1972 directive from President Richard Nixon, intended to reduce Cold War-era secrecy. For 4 years, junior archivists at NARA, under the supervision of Division Head Mr. William H. Cunliffe, had worked their way through a mountain of over 500 boxes from the Air Technical Service Command. The process was mundane, the air in the processing center filled with the rhythmic thump-thump of declassification stamps and the scent of stale coffee. The clerk who stamped File RG-18 on June 2, 1976, likely saw it as just another stack of old engineering reports, having no idea they were releasing a secret that would fundamentally rewrite the history of the largest conflict in human history. The ghost was exorcised not with a bang, but with the quiet thud of an ink stamp. When Dr. Alistair Finch presented his findings at the 1977 Society for Military History Conference in Quantico, Virginia, the initial reaction from the assembled academics was a stunned, deeply skeptical silence. Esteemed historians like Dr. Richard Overy and Dr. Alfred F. Hurley, men who had built their careers on analyzing the strategic air war, couldn't quite believe it. Their narrative, solidified over 30 years, was that the B-29's success was due to its superior altitude, speed, and the sheer courage of its crews. The idea of a secret, war-winning computer felt like science fiction, a detail too fantastic to have been missed for so long. But the evidence was undeniable. Finch's discovery was the key that unlocked 1,000 other mysteries. Military historians like Dr. Conrad C. Crane began a systematic re-examination of the 21 Bomber Command's archives. Suddenly, cryptic maintenance logs from the 58th Bomb Wing on Tinian made sense. Entries that read, replaced 3 6L6 tubes in music box, Unit 44 minus 69,729 inches, or calibrated K4 gyro for Sergeant Miller's crew, were no longer just jargon. They were a detailed record of the secret's daily life. The B-29's astonishingly low 1.5% loss rate to enemy fighters, a statistic long attributed to Japanese pilot degradation, was now seen in a new light. It was the direct result of a machine that made missing almost impossible. The most profound impact was on the men who had lived it. Dr. Finch spent the next 5 years tracking down surviving B-29 crewmen. In a small VFW hall outside Boston, smelling of spilled beer and old cigarette smoke, he sat down with former gunner Michael "Mickey" O'Connell in 1979. As Finch explained the system, showing him the declassified diagrams, the 54-year-old veteran's face was a mask of dawning comprehension. He remembered the low hum in his headset, the strange lack of recoil, the impossible shots. "So that's what it was," O'Connell said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always thought I was just the luckiest son of a bitch in the sky. Turns out I was just pointing for a genius in a box." For thousands of veterans, this revelation wasn't about history. It was deeply personal. It explained their survival, replacing the random cruelty of luck with the elegant certainty of a machine they never knew was guarding them. To confirm his findings, Dr. Finch knew he had to talk to the men who had faced the ghost. In 1982, for a BBC documentary, he traveled to a quiet village near Bonn, Germany, to interview retired General Gunther Rall, the third highest-scoring ace in history. In Rall's study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the faint scent of pipe tobacco, Finch laid the schematics for the A1 Central Fire Control System on a polished mahogany table. The 64-year-old general, a man who had faced death hundreds of times, stared at the diagrams. A full minute of silence passed, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock. Rall finally looked up, his eyes not on Finch, but on a memory from 40 years prior. The confusion, the frustration, the sheer impossibility of what he had seen from the cockpit of his Me-262, all crystallized in that moment. He leaned back in his leather chair, the fabric creaking softly, and uttered the words that would become the system's definitive epitaph. "Asterisk, wir haben gegen Geister gekämpft." Asterisk, he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. Asterisk, we were fighting ghosts. It was not the man. It was the machine. This confession, coming from one of the greatest aviators who ever lived, was the final, irrefutable proof. It was a surrender, not to an enemy nation, but to an enemy technology that was decades ahead of its time, a validation that echoed across the historical community and sealed the legend of the Phantom. The story, once unearthed, spread quickly. Dr. Alistair Finch published his definitive account, The Ghost in the Fortress, Sperry, Draper, and the Secret of the B-29, in 1985, through the Smithsonian Institution Press. The book, which won the prestigious Bancroft Prize, was a masterwork of historical detective work, combining the technical details from File RG-18 with over 200 interviews with American engineers, technicians, and gunners, as well as surviving Axis pilots. Its stark cover, featuring a close-up photograph of the K4 site's glowing reticle, became an iconic image of a secret revealed. Popular historians like Dr. Stephen E. Ambrose wrote articles for magazines, bringing the incredible story to millions. The official history of the air war was rewritten, its central narrative shifting from one of brute force to one of surgical technological lethality. The revelation of the Central Fire Control System did more than just add a chapter to World War II history. It identified the birth of a new era of warfare. Military analysts and technology historians like Dr. E. Norman Friedman immediately drew a direct, unbroken line from the B-29's 65-pound analog computer to the sophisticated digital systems of the modern age. The Ghost's DNA was in the Aegis combat system protecting naval fleets, the fire control suite of the F-35 fighter jet, and the automated phalanx CIWS that defends ships from missile attacks. The secret, unearthed from a dusty file in a Maryland archive, was finally recognized for what it was: the dawn of automated combat. The moment war became a matter of processing speed. The revelation sent ripples through the highest echelons of government and military history. On February 27, 1981, in a sunlit ceremony in the White House East Room, President Ronald Reagan bestowed the National Medal of Science upon a frail but sharp-eyed Dr. Charles Stark Draper. As the 80-year-old physicist accepted the nation's highest scientific honor, the citation specifically mentioned his, quote, pioneering work in inertial guidance and rate-integrating gyroscopes, the very technology that had given the ghost its eyes. The air smelled of floor polish and perfume, a stark contrast to the ozone and oil of his old MIT lab. For Dr. Draper and the surviving members of his team, it was a moment of profound, delayed vindication, a public acknowledgement of a 40-year-old secret that had saved thousands of lives. The history books were literally rewritten. Authors like Dr. Alfred F. Hurley and Dr. Richard Overy, initially skeptical, published revised editions of their seminal works on the air war, now including entire chapters dedicated to the Central Fire Control System. By 1990, the once-secret Project Ivory 7 report, with its stunning final statistics, an estimated 12,000 American lives saved, and a verified kill-to-loss ratio of nearly 7-to-1 against Japanese fighters, was required reading at the U.S. Air Force Academy. The sites of the secret's birth faded back into obscurity. Building 27 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was eventually repurposed for modern avionics research, while the massive Sperry gyroscope facility at Lake Success, New York, where over 350 engineers had toiled, was sold in 1986 and eventually became a corporate office park. The only sound now was the gentle hum of commercial traffic, a quiet ghost of the 12,000 RPM gyros that once spun within its walls. Official honors eventually found their way to the secret's forgotten keepers. Dr. Carl A. Frische, who passed away in 1969, received a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom in a private ceremony for his family on May 18, 1995. More importantly, on Veterans Day of that same year, the surviving members of the Class 843 inches Specialist Technicians, including a 73-year-old Frank Miller, were awarded the Air Force Outstanding Unit Award. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a new exhibit was unveiled, featuring a restored 65-pound A1 computer. As Miller, his hands now wrinkled with age, touched the cool metal casing, he could almost feel the familiar thrum of the 25 vacuum tubes and smell the faint metallic scent of hot solder, a sensory memory of a responsibility he had kept secret for half a century. The Ghost's legacy is now hardwired into every modern military arsenal. The direct conceptual lineage from the B-29's analog brain to today's digital fire control is undeniable. The core principle of the A-1B's radar-linked autonomous targeting is the direct ancestor of the Lockheed Martin AN/APG-81 AESA radar suite in the F-35 Lightning II, which can track over 20 targets simultaneously and engage them without direct pilot aiming. Military strategists like Colonel John A. 13 used the CFCS as the prime case study for what they termed the revolution in military affairs, proving that a single, decisive technological advantage, properly concealed, could render an enemy's entire tactical doctrine obsolete overnight. Years later, in the late summer of 1998, at an air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, Dr. Alistair Finch stood on the tarmac, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and grilled hot dogs. He watched as an elderly Michael Mickey O'Connell, the former B-29 gunner, approached the gleaming, restored fuselage of the B-29 inches Fifi. The old veteran, his steps slow but steady, walked past the plexiglass blisters and the menacing .50 caliber barrels. He stopped amidships, his gaze fixed on a point on the aluminum skin. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it flat against the fuselage, not on a gun port, but on the empty space where, 54 years before, a 65-pound box of gears and tubes had silently, perfectly, and invisibly guarded his life. He closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent, personal thanks to the ghost in the machine,